There is almost nothing worse about growing up than seeing the things that you loved as a child be absolutely destroyed, dismantled, and brutally tortured in the most slow way possible. And I feel like that perfectly encapsulates what we saw this year at E3 2021. Now, I haven't watched the Bandai Namco conference. I'm not going to because they have said they're going to show off a lot of Tales of Arise. I'm already sold on Tales of Arise. I don't want to see any more because I feel like they're starting to get into story elements and I just want to go in blind. So I'm skipping out in the Bandai Namco conference, but I think it's safe to say now that Nintendo's out of the way that what we have seen is not only offensive but just a giant waste of our time. You know, I think about when I was a kid and G4 TV was in its prime and E3 was like the Super Bowl for gamers. I mean, it was just, you saw all the crazy conferences, you saw the games coming out, and you got really excited. It was a really, really fun, exciting time. You would watch the things go hour by hour, and you would look up the new announcements constantly, and it was really cool. It was a lot of fun. And then, things started to change. G4 went under and didn't get as much coverage, didn't get as much press. These companies started being able to handle their own digital distribution of events. And E3 started to come into question as whether we even needed it anymore. Of course, Nintendo stopped showing up to conferences. EA stopped showing up to conferences. Sony stopped making conferences. And I think once Sony left, that was the huge nail in the coffin. And then, of course, last year, E3 was canceled, and we were all excited, ready for E3 to come back this year, make themselves known as the gaming event of the year. And man, they sure made themselves known, but I don't think it was in a good way. I feel like I've wasted almost the entire time I've spent watching E3 this year, with the exception of Microsoft and, to a lesser extent, Nintendo. I thought Microsoft had a really good conference. I thought they did the thing that they've needed to do for the last 4 or 5 years, which was say, hey, here's why we're here. For the last few years, Microsoft, we've all been like, this has to be the one where they show off big games. And they did show off a lot of good games this year. I think the Halo multiplayer looks really cool. It being free is a bold move, and I like that they are going in that direction. They're saying the battle passes aren't expiring over seasons. I'm notoriously not a multiplayer guy, but I think that, going back to my childhood and playing Halo again looks pretty cool. They showed off a great RPG. I think I forget the name of it, but it has an Octopath Traveler type of style, and it's also combining 3D elements. It looks really, really neat. A little furry for my taste, because there's like a wolf man there. I'm not crazy about the furriness, but hey, whatever. It'll suffice. But after that, we saw Starfield. We saw a CG trailer of Starfield, and they say it was in-engine. Doesn't mean anything, guys. When you see things that say in-engine, they might as well just be a trailer, a CG trailer. Like, it means almost nothing until we see gameplay of Starfield, and until we know if it's using the old format of Gamebryo, which is a whole other subject about Bethesda's engine, the creation engine. Until we know what kind of engine it's running, I am not having high hopes for Starfield or Elder Scrolls 6. I'm honestly sick of the Bethesda nonsense. The bugs aren't a feature, and it's a little ridiculous at this point that Bethesda keeps putting out the same type of games with the same bugs that people just have fallen over. So they showed off Starfield, Outer Worlds 2. Of course, Outer Worlds was... I didn't like it, but a lot of other people liked it. And that was pretty much it for the big announcements. I may be missing a thing or two here, but I really wanted to talk about like the crazy, weird stuff that happened at this E3. The next big conference was Square Enix that I watched, and they spent over half the time at the Square Enix conference talking about Marvel games. No mention of Final Fantasy 16, which they showed off last year, and no mention of Final Fantasy 14. I don't think if there was, it was they're in brief highlights. Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 2. You started this Final Fantasy 7 Remake train, and you can't just go quiet on it. I don't think. Now, rumor is that Sony's having an event later in the coming months that might have those Square Enix titles on it, since those are Sony games, but I don't know how I feel about them just going silent on those 3 titles. They also showed off Final Fantasy Collection, which is Final Fantasy 1 through 6, and it is exclusive to mobile games and Steam. Huge misstep on Square Enix's part to make that a mobile and Steam option only. That I don't understand what they're thinking with that. Now, of course, like, I have Steam and I have a gaming PC. I want to play my PlayStation, though. That's where I feel like I want to play my RPGs. I don't want to play my 100-hour RPGs in my computer chair. I can't get into the story and into the world in that environment. So I want to play my RPGs on PlayStation, and I don't understand who at Square Enix thought it would be a good idea to release that collection on PC and on mobile only. It's super crazy, and that's something that fans have wanted a long time. So that was quite a disappointment to me. And the Guardians of the Galaxy game looks cool. The Guardians of the Galaxy game looks awesome, but it's not what people tuned in to see at Square Enix. Now, I understand that they are not just a developer anymore. They are also a huge publisher of games, so they have to show stuff off. But why would you spend over half the conference on not only Guardians of the Galaxy, which I think was like 40%, but then another 15% or whatever on Marvel Avengers, which no one cares about? Honestly, that game had Final Fantasy VII Remake sold so good, and Square Enix was still in the red because of Marvel Avengers, because that game just absolutely tanked. So I don't understand why they're doubling down on Marvel Avengers. At some point you should just cut your losses and just be like, all right, well, this didn't work, so let's move on, because, man, I just don't see how they're ever going to recover from that. But that was pretty much what we saw from Square Enix. They announced some weird Final Fantasy Origins game, which looks, guys, I mean, listen, that game looks so bad, the Final Fantasy Origins game, because they went for like a more edgier approach with the characters and the screaming. Everyone's making the meme about it, the chaos over and over again, just chaos. It was terrible. It was super bad. The gameplay looked stiff, the graphics looked awful, the textures looked terrible, and the characters are the most boring characters I've seen out of any Square Enix game. I mean, they're terrible. I don't know what... the main character's name is literally Jack. See, this is what I feel about Square Enix, that they just constantly are chasing the Western audience, not realizing that they are already popular in the West for the opposite reasons. I feel like Square Enix just wants to be a Western developer with their Japanese RPGs, but it doesn't work out, as we saw with Final Fantasy 15. Probably the worst Final Fantasy game, mainline Final Fantasy game, ever created. I mean, I know people rag on Final Fantasy 13 a lot. I put Final Fantasy 15 so far below 13. I mean, Final Fantasy 15 had a cool open world for the first half, and then absolutely just tanked it in the second half. So I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, they could pull it around, and they could make it a lot more interesting. Honestly, if you speed up the combat a little bit, get rid of the god-awful dialogue, which they did in Final Fantasy 15. They fixed that a little bit. And change the characters, man. That game could be cool. It seems like it's a rehash of Final Fantasy 1, kind of following that same story. I'm not really sure. They haven't really talked about it too much, but super weird. A super weird game shown off for Square Enix. And then, of course, we got Take-Two, the people that make GTA, talking about diversity for, like, hours, which was really strange and a waste of everyone's time. And if you look at the stock, Take-Two stock has plummeted since that. So that was really weird and awful. And then, Nintendo came out. There was like a Verizon panel, a PC games panel. Nothing of note. Nintendo came out and showed off some Tekken characters for Smash Brothers and a new Metroid 2D game, which is pretty cool. And, they showed off Breath of the Wild 2, another trailer instead of gameplay. It's way too long. We're waiting way too long for that game. And it comes out in 2022. So, I don't know, guys. This was a really, really weird E3. And I feel like they just pulled their pants down, spread their brown star, and took crap all over my childhood with this. I mean, if they were trying to solidify themselves as being needed in the gaming world, they did not succeed at all. I don't feel like E3 needed to be here this year, and I feel like these companies trying to meet a deadline and be at E3, have a presence there, only hurt them. You know, maybe Microsoft was the only one, and Nintendo to a certain extent, but Nintendo does their own thing throughout the year. But Microsoft really showed off all their money that they've been putting into these new studio acquisitions and whatnot. And I think that was a real big win for Microsoft. I think Sony probably should have actually shown up and had something to show off. But that was a big win for Microsoft. It made me a huge believer in the Xbox ecosystem going forward, which sucks because I love PlayStation, you know, but Microsoft just had so much more to show this year than Sony. And after Ratchet and Clank came out, we have no PS5 exclusives planned for the future. And the PS5 just came out. So I'm really not sure what Sony's doing over there with Jim Ryan in the lead. But yeah, it's really sad, guys. I don't know. I think E3 doesn't need to come back next year, and the ESA needs to find a different way to supplement their income, because obviously the ESA is a very crucial organization that keeps the government out of rating video games. But I don't think, at what point does necessity override utility? And for how long does that go on? You know, because right now the ESA doesn't really have a whole lot of utility other than rating games and, you know, keeping the government out of it. The ESA came about because of the government trying to step in the 90s. So that was a compromise that we made. And for a long time, about 50% of the ESA's profit came from E3, and I don't think they're going to see that anymore. So I think we either need to think about them downsizing or something like that to get their money that they need for the year. But E3 is not it anymore, guys. I don't know. But that's pretty much all I got to say. And I hope you enjoyed the video. See ya.